So if you've been following the stock market recently, you've probably seen that tech stocks have tumbled a lot. And if you're like me, you're probably looking to buy in on some of them or average down on your initial investment. There are a lot to consider, so I'm going to go over some of my top picks for what I think are some solid investments in the tech sector. Just a small disclaimer, none of this is financial advice. I'm just simply giving you some recommendations. All right, so my first company is Apple. So Apple, their price hasn't risen much post-split, right? They had the split back in 2020, and since then, the price really hasn't gone up that far. There's a lot of growth potential for it. They're getting into health-related services. Their Apple Silicon performs very well considering that they just switched off of Intel Macs, or they switched a lot of their lineup off of Intel Macs, and it's actually some finally good price to performance, right? A lot of people, when they're asking people for recommendations, a lot of people will say don't go Apple because of bad price to performance, but now we're seeing good price to performance with these M1 Macs. Not to mention that the thermals are also great compared to competing Intel and AMD chips, so that's another bonus for Apple. Another thing is that Apple isn't trading at a super high price to earnings ratio. They just had a record quarter for 2020, and it's still trading lower than the price at earnings. So they completely crush earnings. They had record growth, and yet the stock tanked. It's still a large player in the lifestyle and tech sectors. I'd say mainly because of their centralized ecosystem. It's just so fluid how everything kind of just works together. Everything has the same sort of style, and all the software that they have is super clean. I like Apple a lot personally, and I think there's a lot of growth potential for it. Okay, my second pick is Etsy. Etsy is a marketplace for handmade crafts and other home furnishing items. I think a lot of the products on that site are really cool, and it crushed earnings in 2020, 111% revenue year over year. So they increased revenue by a lot, and they outpaced e-commerce growth by more than 2.5%. They have a lot of really cool stuff. They have a good website layout, very intuitive UI, and I don't know, there's something about it, man. I can't tell you what it is, but I just like their site a lot. On top of that, they have 4.1 million active sellers. They made 617 million in revenue quarter four and 1.7 billion revenue for the fiscal year of 2020, which is pretty impressive considering that that's a third of the revenue that they made in just quarter four. Now, Etsy already did have a large run up during the pandemic, but I still think there's a lot of potential for more constant growth because in my opinion, I don't know of any other sites that really competes with Etsy and what they do. The products are good, and COVID shifted a lot more spending from in-person to online. And a lot of people who would have never known about Etsy are now shopping on Etsy, and maybe they're consistent buyers. All right, my next stock pick is Palantir. So Palantir went from $10 to $30 after the IPO. It dropped back a little bit to around $25. It climbed to $35 and then it came back down to around $20 to $25. So somehow, even on good news, the stock price still drops. So they had a blowout quarter three and quarter four earnings last year. They beat earnings per share by 145% and 128% respectively, and they beat revenue by 3.6 and 7% respectively. So they had $2 billion cash on hand for the quarter four of 2020. In that same quarter, they made $322 million in revenue, which was a 40% increase year over year. Now, what Palantir does is that they are a data integration, info management, and a quantitative analysis company. So basically what that means is that they organize and they analyze data. So personally, I don't really know much about Palantir's product lineup in the business. I don't really know much about their competitors. But what I do know is that they do have a lot of government contracts. And the thing about government agencies is that they are very sticky customers. They're not likely to switch off of a service or a product that they're using. About $163 million was made in quarter four 2020 for government contracts, and that was about half of its revenue for the quarter. So I only think that it's going to continue to increase from here. I think they're going to get more and more contracts from the government, which is going to be a good sign for growth for Palantir. All right, my next stock pick is Enphase Energy. Enphase Energy is a residential solar panel company. It's the largest solar company by market cap. It's one of the top holdings in a lot of clean energy ETFs, so ACEs, iClean, QClean, TAN, PCD. It's beat earnings every quarter last year. Revenue growth has exceeded its main rival, SolarEdge. 84% of its revenue came from the US in 2019, but it's slowly growing into other locations. Now, I will say that with the push for a lot of clean energy initiatives in the US, and Biden's expected to put a fair amount of money into that, I think that's going to be very good for Enphase, considering that a good amount of their revenue came from the US. The revenue from Europe grew 67% in Q3 2020, and right now it's sitting at a pretty high price to earnings ratio, so I would wait for it to drop. It already did drop about $50 at the time of writing from its all-time highs, but I still would maybe wait for it to drop a little more because it's still sitting, I think, as of writing, it's still sitting at about an 150 price to earnings ratio, which is pretty high. All right, my last stock pick is Intel. Now, a lot of people are going to say like AMD is way better. Yes, that's true in terms of products, just products. I would say that AMD does have the upper hand in terms of products. Now, Intel is sitting just below pre-pandemic levels while the rest of the market has grown. They've severely underperformed AMD in the past few years, but the thing is that there's a lot of very good news for Intel. So first of all, there's Bob Swan resigning as CEO. Bob Swan was the former CFO of Intel, and he got promoted to CEO. And Pat Gelsinger is replacing him. Pat Gelsinger is the former CEO of VMware, and he's a much more technical guy. So I think he's going to do a lot better job than Bob Swan, because Bob Swan came from a financial position. So obviously he's not going to have as good of an understanding of the technology as someone like Pat Gelsinger. Intel is also moving some of its production to TSMC for some of its lower end chips. It can focus more on the production of its other products as a result in their own facilities. And they plan to have Meteor Lake, which will be their first 7 nanometer in-house process node, along with 5 nanometer TSMC processors sometime in 2022 or 2023. I think there's a lot of growth potential for Intel now, seeing that AMD has started to jack up its prices a little bit for the same level of chip, I guess you could say. And I think Intel is going to have a good amount of growth, considering that the leadership just changed. They're moving some of their production so they can focus more on their in-house chips. And I just think that Intel is going to really start having a comeback, and it's going to grow over the next few years. Intel is also sitting at a very low price to earnings ratio of 12 compared to AMD's 38. It beat earnings all 4 quarters last year. It has $20 billion in revenue, which is still 6 times higher than AMD. They had $6 billion cash on hand, and Intel has a good amount of time to release good products. They have a lot of cash on hand. They have a lot of time to wait this out, perfect something, and then put it out and beat AMD. Now, I'm not saying that I want Intel to win or I want AMD to win. I'm not rooting for either side, because obviously competition from both sides is better for the consumer in the end, and that's better for the investor in the end, because more and more people, I guess, will start looking at these companies and maybe switching to one side or the other depending on which one is the better value. Alright, so those are some of the stocks I picked up and I'm planning to hold in the tech sector, and hopefully this video has helped you make an informed decision on these companies. If you're interested in more stock recommendations or financial news, check out some of my other videos and consider subscribing.